In this episode,
I think one of these ethical lessons you pick up as a kid is, it's learning that you're not special, right? Well, every kid is special, but you know what I mean. Learning that, you're not the center of the universe. That's the admonition you might hear from your parents, right? There are other people here as well. If that were the rule, that we can just play our music loudly whenever we wanted, that society would suck.
then what objection would I have when he's doing it?
Right.
I would have no grounds to that.
Right. But you sound like a Kantian.
But I'm anchoring it to what's good for me, because so in that sense I'm not a Kantian. I'm not saying it's good regardless of the consequences.
Okay. But let's get back to the quasi paradoxical question that I asked you.
When you were saying, "Oh, it's only myself," I was thinking that's the most important person.
Yeah.
This is your life. I mean, don't you want to make? I want to make my life the best that it can be. I think I have one life to live, and I want to maximize the happiness I achieve.
Right. But you're giving me a theoretical response.
Welcome to another episode of the Selfishness Project, where we explore the idea of selfishness. Today, I am pleased to have with me a special guest, Bernard Molyneux, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of California at Davis, and who also happens to be my advisor when I was a graduate student there. So Bernard, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Okay, so let me start out by asking you, just for a concrete example of either someone who, to your understanding of selfishness, you would say this is a selfish person, or just some action which you would think of when someone says, this was a selfish thing to do. Like, what is it? What's a concrete example of some action someone might do that you would think of as selfish?
Well, I think the way the term is normally used, selfishness means some kind of inappropriate self-interest. So somebody showing an excessive interest in themselves. So maybe, I don't know, it would be selfish if I was given a gift to share with someone and then they took the whole of the gift. So maybe a box of chocolates and then they ended up eating them all and they didn't care whether I had any. I'd say that's pretty selfish.
Okay. So maybe doing something for your own benefit where you are in the process of doing that, you're being inconsiderate of others or unfair towards others.
Yeah, I don't think that's all there is to it. I think you can be inconsiderate without being selfish. So I think maybe, if you're working, if you're building a shed and you're hammering away and you're working at 1 a.m. banging that hammer, keeping everybody awake, that can be inconsiderate, but it might not be selfish. You might even be building the shed for your old grandma or something, and it's completely very much a selfless act, but you're being pretty inconsiderate doing it at 1 a.m. So I'm not sure that those are quite the same notion, but yeah, I think they're related.
Okay, so maybe inconsiderateness and selfishness can come apart. I guess in the case of that example, one might think, well, the grandma matters to him. That's one of his personal relatives. So it's in his interest to do something that's going to please her, because then he's going to foster his relationship with her, whereas he might not care so much about the neighbors nearby. So actually this guy is doing something for his own benefit because his grandmother falls within the orbit of his kind of larger sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of the fact that you've got a slightly different, more philosophical, technical understanding of the word selfish. So I think maybe that would count your sense of the term, but I don't think it would count as selfish in the way that I'm using the term, or my common sense understanding of the term. I don't think it's an inappropriate self-regard when you're building your grandmother a shed. I don't know where I came up with that example. But, as for inconsiderate, there's another thing about inconsiderate. I mean, just looking at the word and trying to figure out what it. If you just look at the way it's built up you've got this idea of considering, and then it's inconsiderate. You're not considering others. That seems to suggest a lack of thought. So inconsiderate seems very closely related to the word thoughtless to me. Whereas selfish seems to be orthogonal to that. So I can be selfish while considering others. I think about others. I just don't care. That could be selfish. Whereas being inconsiderate usually means that you didn't think about others. It's not that you were being actively malevolent. You were not trying, or you weren't actively disregarding other people's interests. You were simply, it just didn't occur to you that this would be a problem.
Okay. So, I want to go back for a moment to you said I had a sense of selfishness, which is, I guess, different than the normal sense, if I use it to refer to someone who's building this shelter for his grandmother. So if we think of him as having, in a large sense of self-interest that includes other people, like doing good things for other people, that's not how the term is normally used.
Yeah, there's something that the semantics of the term and its common sense usage, I think, kind of has inappropriate built in. So it's supposed to be some inappropriate self-regard. We're looking after your family. Yeah, that's looking after your interests, I guess. But that doesn't normally fall within the range of something that's selfish. I think in the way the term is normally used.
Okay.
So I think self-interested, I could maybe be talked into that. Because you do have an interest in looking after the people that you love. I'm not sure, I guess you'd have to convince me that when I do something for someone that I love, that it's solely self-interested. So I wonder if the only thing that I'm doing there is looking after my own interests, or whether I'm actually looking after my loved one's interests as well. So I might accept that whenever I do something for a loved one, I am at least partly looking after my own interests. But I'm more reluctant to accept that I'm only looking after my own interests.
Okay. Let me bridge to a slightly different issue. Maybe we can come back to this,
Right.
or weave them together. So there are different ethical theories of how to act: egoism, altruism, deontology, to use a fancy word, which I guess means just doing something not because of the consequences that result from it, but just because for some reason some action is good in itself. Maybe there are other positions. I'm interested in whether you have a view on, or a preference among these theories, or if there's other theories. Do you have a favored ethical theory?
Well, I'm not an ethicist, so I'm going to blunder around a little bit. I can probably give you a better idea of what I like and dislike about these approaches from my fairly naive perspective. I guess less naive than just the average person, but more naive than a professional ethicist. I think that would be easier for me. So I think some of the classical views, the consequentialist views. So let's just take the classical utilitarian view. So the idea there is you do the greatest good for the act in order to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And I guess my issue with that is that it just doesn't seem like it really provides practical advice as to how to live your life. I really have no efficient or even tractable way of figuring out how my actions are going to affect everyone. And I don't know when does that calculation stop. I mean, every act that I have reverberates indefinitely into the future. If I have a child, that's an act. Well, that's, that person may be around for 60, 80, even 100 years. They may have kids, they may have kids, they may have kids. And I think there's a lot of little actions like that, which have a multitude of consequences that are ongoing, never-ending almost, and unpredictable. And so it makes it very hard to try to figure out, well, what's going to cause the greatest good for the greatest number? I think very few cases in real life look like these philosophical trolley cases where you can, kill one person to save five, and even those are can be somewhat difficult. So there's a lot of, if you change the variables on those, they change your intuitions quite radically. I have probably similar objections to the classical Kantian views. You act in such a way that you could will it to be a universal maxim. Again, it doesn't seem like a very practical advice. Not easy to just figure out day to day how each of your actions plays out as a universal maxim. Now, I think these views are nevertheless useful when you're trying to get at what it is that you care about in ethics, and to try to dig into those views. But as practical codes for living by, I don't think they're very useful. The egoist, I think, is much more commonsensical in so far as act according to your own interests. If that's understood in an extended way, to include, my interest in my wife, my interest in my family, my extended interest in that sense. Look after your own garden. If that's the idea there, then I think that seems to cleave more closely to something intuitive. I think the price of that is that it might not yield as many insights. One philosophical view you could have, let's call it intuitionism, is act according to what's ever ethically intuitive, and you never get counterintuitive results if you do that. But it doesn't give you any kind of deep unifying principle. So sometimes when I think about egoism, I find that it provides me with a fairly straight path. There's a couple of bumps back to my intuitive views, but the price of that is I'm not getting an insight into why I have those particular intuitions.
Okay. I'm interested in the bumps you just mentioned. So there's certain...
Well, this comes back to the thing that we were talking about earlier, which is, well, what do you mean by my interests? Act only according to your own interests. If I build my grandmother a shed for her yard, and I feel like I'm doing something nice for my grandma, so I feel like I'm looking after her interests. But I think you would claim I'm only looking after my own interests. I'm not sure. I guess I don't find it intuitive to just look after my own interests, to just use it's kind of bringing the Kantian notion, to just use my grandmother as a means to an end, to just use my grandmother as a way of satisfying my own interests. That seems very kind of, mercenary and exploitative, and doesn't seem very ethical at all. It seems almost like a sham of ethics, like you're a kind of sociopath going through the motions. So I sometimes worry with egoism that it's extensionally getting the answers that I like with things like that. Like it's saying, yeah, you should go help your grandma build a shed. So it's giving me that answer. But when you look at the reasons why I'm doing that, those aren't the reasons that I think are the ethical reasons for doing so.
Okay, so digging into this example a bit, let's suppose that first of all, I am sensitive to this issue of saying, I don't, like, it's kind of delicate the way you need to put it, I think, to make it seem like it's not this sociopathic kind of view.
Yeah.
If you say you only care about your interests and not hers, there's something weird about that. But if you phrase it a bit differently, like, the reason I care about her interests is because they dovetail with mine, maybe that doesn't sound as bad. But let me...
It still sounds kind of bad to me.
Let me put this, give you this scenario and see what you think. So let's suppose that you're not going to get anything for yourself out of building your grandmother this shed. You're not going to get any internal satisfaction, no deep kind of meaningful experience. It doesn't give you any happiness. No benefit accrues to you at all from doing this. In that case, do you like it's not helping you have a good warm relationship with her over time? None of that is expected from this action. If that's the case, do you still think it would be a good idea to build this shed?
Well, it's one of those cases where, in order to get myself into the thought experiment, I have to imagine certain elements of it in the background. I have to imagine that, we've really fallen out. So for me to get nothing from helping my grandmother, we really must have, we must be in a bad place in our relationship. I mean, what did she do? Did she abuse me as a child or something? I mean, I have to start thinking like that. And then I think I'm sullying the thought experiment. Because I think you want some kind of flat, neutral, you have no interest, but you don't have any kind of antipathy towards your grandmother. There's just nothing in it for you. But I'm struggling to get into that headspace. I think real situations just aren't like that. I can take the thought experiment seriously, nevertheless, if you want, and try to push through it and give you whatever intuitions I have. But I warn you, they may be sullied.
Sure, or we could do both cases. We could take the case where you do have antipathy, so it seems more realistic.
Yeah.
And then also the case where, for just whatever reason, maybe your emotional you had a brain operation and your emotions just got switched off.
Right.
Would there still be then?
Well, I certainly. So let's think about it. So I'm building the shed for my grandmother. So normally I would not think, ordinarily I would not think I was obliged to build a shed for my grandmother. And there might be cases where I would feel like that. If she'd been an extraordinarily good grandmother, or she was really couldn't help herself and couldn't afford anybody to do it for her. You can set up enough elements where I might feel a sense of obligation. But I would normally think that it's supererogatory, that I'm doing something nice, not because I have to, ethically, but just because, I'm going above and beyond. Now, in that case, if we now imagine that, well, yeah, your grandmother and you have a terrible relationship, and she was awful to you pretty much your whole life, well, I would be disinclined to go above and beyond for her in that case. I probably wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't feel ethically bad about it, because, as I said, it's above and beyond in the first place. It's not an obligation. So in that case, I wouldn't do it. I don't know if that's the answer to your question.
So in this is one case where, since it's not benefiting you, I guess, because you have this grudge against her, you're therefore not going to benefit her. It's only insofar as, well, this is what I'm ultimately trying to get at. Is it only insofar as you do somehow benefit from doing this for her that you will actually?
No, but you see, if we change the case to where, I mean, I think I can imagine a case that's something like this. Especially, this would likely be my attitude in my late teens. Somebody suggests to me that I should go help build my grandmother's shed, and I don't want to. I want to hang out with my friends. I don't think there's anything in it for me, except hard work, which is a negative. I'm not going to get paid. Grandma's got no money. She's not going to love me any less. She's my grandma. She loves me like crazy, and doesn't matter what I do, right? Quite frankly, she hugs me too much, and it's always a bit, I don't want to go. I don't want to do it, but I do it. And yeah, I think I'm solely acting out of her interests. There's nothing in it for me. She won't love me more. She's got no money. She won't love me less if I don't. It's just, it's my grandma. I'll do it. Fine.
So I guess in that scenario, I'm wondering, would it be better not to do it if you judge that you're not getting anything out of this?
No, I think it's better to do it. I mean, that's my intuition.
Okay. I guess I want to understand.
I think that teen, despite all the griping and moaning and rolling of the eyes, if at the end of it that teenager actually then does help the grandma build a shed, I think that is a sign of character. And you know, that's a good kid. They're gonna grow up okay.
So, I mean, what makes that the better thing to do? If it's just a brute intuition, I guess we can't really unpack it and say why. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering.
But this is bad for the egoist, right? This is not bad for me. I mean, I just bring the intuitions to the table. I'm not bringing a theory here. But if your theory doesn't account for why that's the right thing to do, then that's a mark against your theory.
Well, I mean, the theory might say it's not a good thing to do, and that you actually shouldn't do this, and maybe you have the intuition, let's call it, that you should, but maybe that's, I don't know if intuitions can be mistaken, but it's an intuition one might want to question. I mean, I can imagine myself if I'm in that situation and I don't foresee any benefit coming to me, like I'm not fostering my relationship with my grandmother. She didn't do anything to.
I mean, well, okay. So let me jump in there. I mean, maybe a point that you could make is that, well, even though your relationship may not hinge upon you helping your grandmother today, so you can do it today, and you know she can't possibly love you anymore because she loves you as much as she can already, and if you don't do it, she won't love you any less because, you know, it's just, she's your grandma. She's going to love you no matter what. But it's nevertheless in your interests to nurture the relationship. So maybe today you don't have to, but you do have to be putting in some effort into the relationship, you know, periodically, at times, enough of the time. And it is in your interest to do that, then you might be able to defend, the theory might be able to account for it with a strategy like that,
Yeah, and if that's how, I mean, that is why I, as an egoist, meaning someone who does what's best for himself or thinks it's good to do what's best for oneself, that's how I would justify that.
Right.
Maybe, I mean, there's all kinds of things where I'm not getting any immediate, obvious, I don't get like a chunk of cash for doing it.
Right.
But it's a small part maybe of fostering this healthy, enjoyable relationship over decades.
Yeah. No, and I think there are parts of that definitely ring true for me. I mean, so one of the things that people will say, you know, let's imagine the case of the teen once again who doesn't want to go around and see grandma, and you know the parent figure would say something like, she's not going to be around forever, you know, and you're going to regret it that you didn't take the opportunity to spend time with her later in life. So again, that's an appeal to your self-interest. So I think you could possibly make some good moves there, some good points on behalf of your view. So let me ask you something. So I guess one of my core ethical intuitions, I'm not sure this is an intuition or maybe this is just a piece of theory that I picked up at an early age, but is that ethics is supposed to be externally directed. It's supposed to be about doing well by others, right? Now, but you fundamentally don't think that. You think that it's all about serving your own interests. And I guess I've two issues with that. So the first one is, like I say, I have this
fundamentally about serving your interests.
So I have this instinct that ethics is supposed to be about helping others. But I also have another issue, which is, well, why is this ethics at all? What you're talking about is something else. It's more like kind of, you know, just behaving rationally, right? We don't even need ethics to say that you should behave according to your own self-interests. we could just dispense with ethics. Why aren't you an ethical nihilist?
Yeah, so I guess here we're getting to the conception of what is ethics. Like, how should we understand it? If it's intrinsically, or like by its very nature, it's an other regarding kind of field, then yeah, I guess what I'm advocating is a non or ethical view or an amoral kind of view. But then I would wonder, why are we defining ethics in this other regarding way? I mean, if we think of ethics as just the science of what is good, figuring out what is a good way to live, well, why should that prejudge the issue of whether the good way to live is to be other regarding or to be self-regarding? Why isn't that, at least at the outset, left as an open question?
Yeah, I mean, I admit that I don't know the answer to the question I'm about to ask, or have any good way to answer it. But well, the good here is there are different kinds of good. So it's good not to eat too much cholesterol. It's not. I don't think that is an ethical thing. I certainly think of it as acting in your own self-interests. If you want to be healthy, you don't want to eat too much of one food, too much fat, too much cholesterol. You don't want to eat too much sugar. So that's a self-interested act, but I don't think of it as an ethical act. So maybe I should ask this question: what differentiates the self-interested acts that are ethical from those that are not ethical?
So I guess on my initial thought on that is, I don't see that we need to draw a distinction between ethical acts and self-interested acts. I think it could turn out that ethics is essentially about benefiting oneself. And I mean, we could discuss, is that a right way to think of ethics? But I don't see that as being off the table, or why that should be a view that's off the table from the beginning. I mean, why not just take the view that ethics is the science that studies whatever is good, and then whatever turns out to be good is by definition ethical. So if it turns out that eating cholesterol is a good thing for you, then it's an ethical thing for you. Why not just go with that? And that's actually what I think. Like, if I'm on a diet, and my doctor tells me, you're in danger of having a heart attack if you don't cut back on cheesecake and other fatty foods, and I nevertheless indulge my short-range desires to, have the cheesecake, I actually think of that as an unethical thing to do. I think that is an immoral choice to make, and maybe that's running counter to how most people think of ethics. I guess there's this term prudential, like it's prudential to do certain things, but not necessarily moral. And I think of that as perhaps a false alternative.
Well, yeah, I think it's not completely counterintuitive that that's got an ethical dimension. So, you think of in the Christian tradition, you've got the 7 deadly sins, and I think one of them is gluttony. So you can think of that as being kind of a similar idea. Like, well, if I'm a glutton, assuming, maybe if I'm a glutton and I'm hogging the food that others could be eating, then that's an other-directed objection to my being a glutton. But you might also think that, well, no, you're abusing yourself by being a glutton. Similarly, if I'm slothful, if I'm lazy, if I just sit around playing video games all day, well, what harm is it doing? It's not harming anybody else. You might take the view that there's nothing ethically objectionable about doing that because there's no sin that's other directed. But you might also take this view, no, there's some kind of wrong performed against the self in that case. So maybe that that isn't so counterintuitive. I had another question I wanted to ask though. Oh, right. It's this. If you think of ethics as just being the study of what's good, or as you put it, the science of the good. I'm not sure it's the science, but we don't have to get into that. So, okay, great. So, what's good for me is, I don't know, making some money. What's good for, some homeless person that I meet is I give him the money. Now, let's assume that I have no interest in giving the homeless person money. I'm not serving any of my interests. Let's just stipulate that. But I would be serving his interests in giving him the money. Now, my question is, okay, well, one of these is good for me. One of these is good for him. Why should I prefer the one that's good for me over the one that's good for him? If all we're interested in here is doing the good, maybe I should just flip a coin. There's a good either way. One good for me, the different good for him. And of course, there's a second. I mean, I don't really want to get into this. It's not really my point. My point isn't, oh, you could do more good to him because that money will be worth more to him. I think that's an auxiliary point in the background. But I want to just focus upon this idea of, well, if you're studying the good, there is no the good if all the goods are relative to different individuals. And given that they are, why should I prefer the good for me over the good for you? It's all good.
Interesting question. So, I think we do need to. I need to say more about this idea of the good. So, one idea I had as you were setting that case up is, where do we get the idea of the good? And maybe that can, if we explore that, that can help us at least part of the way to resolve this issue. And I think that our notion of the good ultimately comes from pleasure, our experience of pleasure, and that this is something we have in common with animals, maybe even lower organisms. There's also pain, which is the bad. So nature...
And this is broadly conceived, so you're going to count things like nausea as the bad as well. Even though it's not painful as such.
Right. It's got some negative valence to it.
Yeah, okay. So phenomenal states, it's all going to ground in valence-loaded phenomenal states. States with
and I think we have nature just builds into us these experiences. We have this pleasure-pain mechanism, and what we experience as good is good for us. So when I have that pleasure from eating the cake, it's my pleasure. It's not just pleasure, the pleasure.
Yeah.
And when I get cut by a knife, it's my pain.
Right.
And so it's kind of later we can sort of abstract away the issue of, there's the beneficiary, and then there's the phenomena in the abstract.
Yeah.
But our initial notion of the good is the good for us. That's how I think of it. And
to begin with,
and I guess my way of thinking of it is I kind of just carry that forward in a more broad. So with when you're just a baby or a primitive organism, your only conception of the good is these immediate pleasurable experiences that you have. You're drinking your milk, or your food, or whatever. And then as you mature, you become more long range, and you realize, okay, going to the dentist causes me pain right now, but in the future, I'm going to have a lot more pain if I don't get this taken care of. So I can do what's overall most pleasurable for me if I actually endure some short run pain. And so I think of my own way of thinking about it, which is not unique to me, but is that we just take this primitive conception of good, and over time we learn to expand it in a way that's best for ourselves overall, that gives us the most pleasure overall, which includes becoming more and more long range. And so
Okay,
it's
but okay, if I can jump in there.
yeah.
So one of the abstractions we do is we move away from immediate rewards and punishments to thinking more long term. And I think that's one way to abstract away from my pleasure right now, my pain right now. But isn't there another dimension via which you can abstract, which is you realize other people are in the same position that I'm in. They have pleasures and pains as well. And that sometimes my taking a particular pleasure is going to cause pains to others, and maybe it isn't worth it. So I'll give you kind of a very ordinary example. You know, I like driving down the street in my convertible with my super boombox speakers blaring away at the back, playing Five for Fighting, 100 Years, is that what it's called? You know, everybody gets to listen to it. I love it. I'm having a great old time. I just feel great. What could be better than driving down the street, playing my music this loud? It's like I've got my own personal nightclub that moves down the street. It's great. And then, you know, one day I realized, oh wait, not everybody likes my music. Not everybody's in the mood for listening to music at that particular moment. Not everybody wants their cars to vibrate to the strains of Five for Fighting. So it's kind of inconsiderate of me to do that. And so now I've got an equation to balance. I have to ask myself, well, is it worth it? I guess this is where I'm going to sound like a consequentialist. Am I doing enough good for myself to outweigh the ways in which I'm detracting from other people's sense of well-being? And I think, isn't that a legitimate direction of abstraction? And I'm not necessarily, this isn't necessarily about whether or not this is going to come back and bite me in the ass. I'm not looking after my own interests here. I'm not thinking, oh, well, these people might complain or they might try to call the cops on me or something. That's not the issue here. Let's just assume that I'm confident they won't. I can get away with it. I'll never see these people again. But isn't there something ethical about just turning the music down in that situation?
Yeah, my sense is there is.
I want to keep in focus the deeper theoretical point here, because you did something interesting. You said we have this immediate acquaintance with pain and pleasure, but then we abstract to our futures and we do this kind of long-term calculation. Well, I'm suggesting that it's just as legitimate to abstract orthogonally to other people and do that kind of calculation as well. Why isn't that just as legit?
Well, I guess in this case of the boombox, I would want to try to make a case that if you do this kind of abstraction from the immediate pleasure, you would reasonably conclude that this is actually not in my own long-range self-interest. And putting myself in that actual situation, I think I would feel guilty actually in that moment, because the long-run consequences to me are like, I'm aware of them at that time, so I don't think there would even be a temptation for me. So can I say more about like why I don't think it would be in my interest? Well, I guess, I like to live in a society where people are considerate and respectful of each other's space, and I want to foster that benevolent kind of society, and I feel like I would be thwarting that goal.
Okay, so just to complicate this for you, so are you saying you want to live in a society where people look out for other people's interests as well as their own?
Well, if that's
kind of like meta self-interested, and you kind of, I have an interest in living in a society where people aren't egoists.
Well, I don't know that it should be interpreted as people aren't egoists, because if we all have an interest in living with each other, I mean, there are certain others which it's not in our interest to live with, like homicidal maniacs, serial killers, and we lock those people up, or at least I, as an egoist, would want to lock those people up.
Right.
But then there are other people, homeless people on the street. Also, I'm not really benefiting from them. Not that I think they need to be locked up because they're not doing the kind of harm that the killer is, but there are certain people who are productive. They create values, and then I can trade. I can also myself produce values by working a job, and then I can trade with other people instead of having to create everything on my own, be a self-sustaining farmer. It's in my interest to live in a division of labor society.
Right.
Now, I think part of that is when you get people together, we need some way to make human relationships predictable, and in a way such that we do have people who want to come together into this society and take reap the benefits of it. And those benefits can only be reaped under certain conditions. And if one of the rules of society, I mean, I think one of those conditions is that, when you're in a public place, you have to be respectful or considerate that other people might have different tastes in music. So if you want to have a successful society where you can reap these kind of division of labor benefits, among others, friendships would be another, there are certain things you need to abide by, and you could flaunt and just ignore those and maybe not get thrown in jail, but I guess it's something about like the principle you're acting on is it's not consistent with. There's some kind of tension between the kind of society you want and then the way you're acting. If you blare the radio,
act in a way that you could will to become a universal law. That's what you're saying.
To put it in Kantian terms, I don't know if I would want to subscribe to that.
But it's a little bit like that. I mean, it's in the same neighborhood, isn't it? It's I want to act in a way that I want people in general in society to behave, right? So I'm not going to play my music loudly because I don't want everybody else. Because if that were the rule, that we can just play our music loudly whenever we wanted, that society would suck.
Then what objection would I have when he's doing it?
Right.
I would have no grounds to that.
Right. But you sound like a Kantian.
But I'm anchoring it to what's good for me, because so in that sense I'm not a Kantian. I'm not saying it's good regardless of the consequences.
Okay. But let's get back to the quasi paradoxical question that I asked you. So, are you telling me that as an egoist you have an interest in living in a society where people aren't egoists?
That's not what I'm saying, or at least not what I intend to be saying.
Right. So, because it sounds a little bit like, well, I don't want to live in a society. I have an interest in not living in a society where everybody just looks after their own interests without regard. I'm thinking this through. I suppose what you really want to do here is you want to say, well, no, I want to live in a society where everybody has the same attitude as me. So they act only in their own interests, and they all appreciate that acting in their own interests means not creating a society where everybody goes around playing their boombox all the time. So,
yeah, I would like to live in a society where people have this kind of large, broad understanding of self-interest, not just tunnel vision, short-range kind of satisfaction.
Right. So one of the things that you said, by the way, was you used the word guilt somewhere in your last answer, and it kind of just.
I don't remember using it.
Yeah, you said I feel guilty sometimes when I can't remember what the context was now, but you can rewind the clip.
If I were playing the boombox, I think I would feel.
Yeah, I would feel guilty right there and then. That's what you said.
Because of the consequences.
Yeah. So guilt is an interesting question, because I also think of guilt as being something that occurs when I do wrong by others. So let's go back to the 7 deadly sins again. If I'm being slothful, I might feel a little bit. I guess you could call it guilty. If I'm being gluttonous, maybe a little bit, but usually if I can frame it as just, well, the only person harmed was myself, I can usually kind of wriggle out of the feelings of guilt. I only harmed me. I let me off. It's fine, Bernard. Oh, okay, thanks, Bernard. I seem to be able to escape these feelings of guilt more easily than if I've wronged someone else. Can you say something about that? Because if all ethics reduces to violation of your own self-interest, then I guess I struggle to see why there would be a difference between my levels of guilt when I wrong someone else versus when I wrong myself.
So, I mean, maybe there shouldn't be. Maybe it should be reversed. Actually, I was thinking, like, when you were saying, oh, it's only myself, I was thinking, that's the most important person.
Yeah.
This is your life. I mean, don't you want to make... I want to make my life the best that it can be. I think I have one life to live, and I want to maximize the happiness I achieve.
Right, but you're giving me a theoretical response, right? So I know what your theory says, and I don't know whether it's different for you. Maybe it is different for you, and maybe my attitudes are a reflection of some kind of deeply held quasi-theory that I have that I'm kind of only dimly aware of. But I feel more guilt when I let someone else down than when I let myself down. Now you can say, well, you're the most important person, so you shouldn't feel more guilt. Oh, okay, maybe, but I do. Now, what explains that? Am I doing something wrong, or are you doing something wrong? You're not explaining the way our ethical instincts really work.
So, a couple thoughts here. One is, I do feel guilt when I do wrong by myself, by my own standards. So, if I, fail to adhere to a diet, if I'm on a diet, or an exercise regime I'm on, or if I don't study for a test or write a paper on time, and I think afterward, oh, I could have done better. I do feel guilty. And now, do I feel more guilty if I do wrong to somebody else? Maybe. It depends on the wrong. I think what exactly is the severity of the wrong I do to them? Did I steal $1 from them?
Mm-hmm.
Was I a little bit rude to them? Did I steal $10,000? So I think the level of guilt is going to vary. But in any case, I think the guilt that I do feel is going to be because I feel like I did not live up to being the kind of person that I expect myself to be. So I failed to live up to my own standards, and somebody else played a role in this whole guilt episode. But it all redounds back to me. It's because I failed to achieve living as the kind of person that I expect myself to be. So I failed myself, basically.
Right.
It's not that I did harm to them, although I did do harm to them, but I feel really bad in doing that because I don't want to
so
be that.
Let me throw in a case here. So I think this is going to relate to this. I hope it's not just going to be a completely different idea. But so one day you're walking down the street and you hear a yell from a house, and the front door is ajar. So you kind of push it. Hello, are you okay? And I've had an accident. And you go in and you see an old person, maybe an old man, and he's fallen over and he's cut himself badly. He's bleeding out, and you realize there's nothing you can do. He's going to die. So you call the ambulance, but there's really nothing you can do. I mean, you can try your best. And then you notice there's a stack of $10 bills just on the table. Maybe he was getting ready to pay some bills or something. And you realize you could just pocket those. And he doesn't need them. and might as well be you as anyone else has that money. What would you do, and would you feel bad about it?
So, inheritance comes to mind. I mean, um, so it's possible, very possible, that this guy has a will,
Mm-hmm.
and that's once he goes, there's someone that he would like his property to go to, and I guess that would be my base assumption, my default assumption. And going back to the point about what kind of society do I want to live in, well, in this case, do I want to live in a society where people just grab some immediate.
Well, the difference with this case and the boombox case is the boombox case is kind of a common scenario. I mean, if we lived in a society where people just played music as loud as they wanted, then it would probably be happening all the time. But this is a very unusual situation. You can live in a society where people swipe the money from your table as you're dying, and I'm not sure. Well, I mean, it's a good question for the egoist. I mean, even if you did live in, even if it was common, why would that be bad for you? And so that's A. And B, I don't think it's going to be common, so I don't think you need to worry about the society-wide effects anyway. So I don't think you're going to get bitten back in the way that you're worried about. So let's take both scenarios. Number one, let's suppose by curious coincidence, many years later, you fall over, yell, your door's ajar, somebody comes in, you left a stack of tenors on the table, and they take it. Did that harm your interests?
Well, I guess after I'm gone, I wouldn't have any interest to be harmed.
Right, so
maybe no is the answer to that. But I think the person, I would still want to make to the case that the person who did swipe it,
yeah.
it harms that person's interests. Okay, why? I guess my thought is the person, what's to stop him from doing similar kinds of things?
Well, it's opportunistic. That's kind of part of the case.
Yeah.
So it's not going to happen very often.
Well,
I'm not sure. Even if it did happen a lot, what's the harm? I mean, this person's swiping money from people who are dying. I see an ethical issue here. I mean,
yeah.
Of course, this is why I'm raising the case. But I'm wondering how you account for this theoretically. So I'm going to argue as if I'm a stone-cold egoist, wondering why you're such a warm and fuzzy egoist. So what is the harm in?
Well, maybe the part of the reason you end up stone cold is because you're doing these kinds of things. If you have this, I mean, I think you might actually do damage to your psychology and your benevolent outlook on life by engaging in these short range kinds of acts. And I think that's part of my answer as to why these are bad for you. Your act, unprincipled is another term that comes to mind here. There's so many situations, like, okay, let's say.
So can I just jump in here? Because so now, try and get a better understanding of the egoism that you defend. It seems like this seems to be less a theory of the good, per se, in some kind of abstract, logical, universal sense, and more a view about what's good for humans, given that when the going gets tough, you import assumptions about human psychology. So in this case, you're saying, look, it's going to be corrupting to a human being to behave like that. Let's imagine an alien, right? So imagine there are aliens that don't have the same psychology that we have. These aliens, let's imagine, they have, it doesn't corrupt them to do these little, to swipe money off the table of the dying conspecifics. It doesn't corrupt them. They have more resistance to this corruption that you're worried about. It just doesn't happen with them. Then it wouldn't be a problem for them to do it.
Yeah, I guess if you stipulate that the alien doesn't suffer this kind of psychological damage from acting in these short-range ways, then offhand I don't see that there would be grounds.
Okay, so you could also imagine perhaps some kind of personality disorder that a human could have, where it doesn't bother them either. So kind of like an antisocial personality disorder, maybe some variant of that, or some kind of partial variant of that, where for the most part, this person's like me or you, but just when it comes to things like that, he's not going to miss it, says this person to themselves. The dying man's not going to miss the money. I'll take it. And when they and it just doesn't bother them at all. It doesn't corrupt them at all. It doesn't make them any worse. You say in that case, well, here's a good distinction. You say it's not only permissible, but I think you might even say it's morally obligatory for them to swipe the money.
Yeah, offhand, I think if we're stipulating that this person has a personality disorder, where they don't suffer these kinds of consequences I've been describing, then yeah, I think it might be the right thing for that person to swipe the money.
So now we move to the case of the sociopath.
Yeah.
And the DSM criteria, I believe they took sociopath out, and I'm not sure. I think it's been replaced with antisocial personality disorder and so on. But if I'm speaking about a purely theoretical condition here, that's no longer regarded as part of proper psychology, then okay, fine, doesn't matter. The point is that you can imagine people who struggle to empathize with other people, struggle, I think in the terms of your theory, other people's welfare. Now that might not be the normal state of human beings, but that seems to be the case with these people I'm stipulating. They just don't have an interest in other people's welfare. Then we're going to get an awful lot of situations with those people where things that we would ordinarily regard as unethical are not only permissible but obligatory, according to your theory.
Yeah, and so, I mean, the ethics I'm proposing, so we might want to, I mean, the term that's coming to mind is morality for psychopaths.
Yeah.
That might look much different than morality for normal human beings. And when I say I favor an egoist kind of view, I'm talking about assuming normal human beings. I mean, I think, so yeah, things might look different if we're talking about exceptional cases. It's good for humans to eat, maybe couple pounds, 2-3 pounds of food a day. But if you're a whale, then that's not going to cut it. You're going to starve. You need to eat a lot more. Well, likewise with the psychopath, you have a different nature.
Right.
So what's good for you is going to look different, given your different nature.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. The whale case is a good one, and so you might think, I'm fond of talking about black widows. I love spiders to begin with, but the male black widow mates and is then eaten by the female black widow, and according to some observers, the male launches itself onto the fangs of the female. Now, okay, you might think ethics for black widows is very different. This kind of murdering your mate is much more okay for black widows. Now, of course, there are animals that are behaving as instinctively, but imagine an evolved black widow that is smart and starts to develop its own ethics. Then it might start saying, "Well, murder's wrong. Not if it's after the act of copulation and the female is murdering the male in order to provide nutrients for her young. That's the way it's always been done, and it's a good thing." Now, so I can appreciate to a certain extent, okay, maybe ethics is going to be relative to the nature of the individuals in question, certainly at a special level. But I guess I have a tougher time thinking of psychopaths as being the right type of. It's one thing to break it down by species, but to break it down within human society by saying, well, okay, that person's a psychopath, so what Hannibal Lecter did isn't just permissible, given that he's a psychopath. It was morally obligatory. We should we should be celebrating him. He's such a good person relative to his own, relative to the ethics defined for him. That seems like a hard bullet to bite.
I don't know that it's like. I mean, I think it would be great or progress if we could just agree on ethics for normal people, because I think just that is controversial enough.
Okay.
Not to say we don't need to discuss this any further.
Well, yeah, you can definitely say bad cases make for bad theories. So you should try to. You're a scientist. You want to create a theory that works for the normal cases, and then the aberrant cases should be treated as exceptions. You want to build the laws around that.
Yeah, like a life. Ayn Rand talks about lifeboat cases. She has an article called "The Ethics of Emergencies," and things might look a lot different in such cases. Like normally, we shouldn't kill each other. But if you're on a lifeboat that can only hold one person, and there's two people on it, it would be permissible in that case to kill the other person. But we don't live on lifeboats,
right?
At least most of the time. So
Would you feel bad?
Possibly, very possibly.
Why?
Assuming the person is innocent.
Yeah, well, but you did what was the moral good. Right?
I might even choose to kill myself if I'm in that situation. If the other person is my wife, suppose. If it's someone
because you have it's more in your interests to save
your
wife?
Because I might be so depressed living without her that I'd rather just die than go on without her.
Right. But you feel bad if it was just a random innocent.
Yeah, if it were just a random innocence and it was either my life or that person's.
Why would you feel bad?
I guess this goes back to the benevolence that I like to experience in relationships with other people.
But you want to live in a society, surely, where people do kill people to save themselves in lifeboats. So you're not going to be able to use a variant of that response here.
Well, in a way, this is kind of a non-societal scenario. I mean, society is like we are right now, where we have this long-run existence. We're not in this immediate situation where one of us is about to expire.
No, but part of what it is to live in society is to internalize a set of values that does include how you should behave in emergency situations, right? And so we have kind of rules about, well, if somebody falls over, call an ambulance, maybe give them CPR if somebody knows how to do that, ask if there's a doctor in the house. We know what to do in emergency situations, and so do you want to live in a society where the rule in emergency situations is if the lifeboat can't hold two, murder the other person? Well, I think you do want to live in that society because that's what you've been endorsing. So when you then do that, given that it's in accord not only with your personal values but also in accord with the society that you want to live in, why did you feel bad?
Just want to make a comment on. So my view is not that if you're in this lifeboat situation, you should kill the other person. I think it's very contextual. It would depend. I don't know what I would do if it was just an innocent person who was there with me. I might feel so sickened by the act of having to kill the other person to save myself. It might haunt me for the rest of my life as just this really disgusting thing to do. That I would rather not go on. So that's not the rule. But whatever I see as being in my long-term self-interest.
So this comes back to the psychology thing. You having the particular compassionate psychology that you have means that. So egoism works well, maybe in capturing the intuitions, when we couple it with the assumption that human beings.
Due to technical difficulties, a small amount of audio was lost at this point. After fixing the problem, we picked up a thread from earlier in the conversation.
All right, so we are back with part 2, having adjusted our recording equipment, and Now, Bernard was saying something. Oh, he was asking about we learn. Suppose it's true that we learn about the good and bad from these pleasure and pain experiences we have, but does that suffice to ground the idea?
Yeah, so you said, our first experiences of the good and the bad is our own pains and pleasures. But then we're able to abstract from that. So we're able to realize that, well, there's more that's good and bad in the world than just what's immediately good and bad. And so we project into the future. And I was suggesting all of this suggests that an epistemic view, this is a view about how we learn about what's good and what's bad. But when we realize that other people have pains and pleasures too, then we realize that the good and the bad is not something that is that happens, exists just within us as individuals. It's not something that just exists within me. I realize that it exists within everyone, and that it applies over everyone. And that insight, I think, is where we get this other directed notion of ethics. Now, so my question is this: why would I think that it's more than that? Why would I think that I have a special obligation to myself, rather than I have a special obligation just to minimize these things that I've discovered in myself, pains, and I have a special obligation to maximize these things I've discovered in myself, pleasures and feelings of joy. But why should I think that my special obligation is just to maximize them and minimize them in myself? Well, that's why I discovered them.
Yeah.
But I know they're elsewhere as well. So shouldn't I just maximize and minimize them across the board?
So I guess the why care about it if it's not in yourself? And I think if we consider this kind of idea of there's this gradation of things you care about the most, like there's yourself, and there's your spouse, your family, your relatives, your friends, someone in the next neighborhood, someone in the next country, someone on Mars or in the next galaxy. I think as it's getting closer to yourself, you do tend to care more about, well, there's a question of what you do care about more than whether you should care about it more. And I guess I'm of the thought that there's something, I don't know if intrinsic is the right word, but it's just kind of like the burden is on the person who wants to say why you shouldn't care about it. I don't have to do a big song and dance to say why I should care about my pleasure. It's just great. I mean, I experience it. And
let me meet the burden.
Okay.
Because they're the same. Because my pains and your pains are the same.
But not for me.
Right.
I experience my pains in a lot different than the way I experience your pains.
Yeah.
So
But me and you are the same.
I mean, in some sense.
All you told me is that your pains are different relative to X. I mean, let's just take me and you out of it. X's pains are different relative to X. Y's pains are different relative to Y. Sure, but X and Y are not importantly different. They're both human beings. So why should one of those pains be more valuable than the other?
I mean, I don't see what the issue is if we're factoring in the agent's experience. Like, I experience. Say I'm eating food right now, and that gives me a sensation of pleasure, and say simultaneously, some guy over there who I don't know at all is also eating food and also getting pleasure. Why should I care about my pleasure more than his? I mean, I don't know. Here I want to say again, because it's mine. his having the pleasure doesn't do me any good, and I like things that do me good.
Yeah, but
I don't know if I can say more. I feel like I'm
but his having the pleasure does him good.
okay, so it's good for him to eat for him,
Yeah,
but not
exactly.
for me.
So why should you do what's good for this person over here rather than for that person over there?
I don't know that that needs an answer. I mean, part of me is thinking like, well, it's just obvious why I should want to do something that's good for me or that gives me pleasure. There's like something intrinsically appealing or attractive about having this experience, which I don't get when he has that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that I like having this experience and that I don't like that,
But
at least not
seems
as
like
much.
it seems like we're just kind of we're turning around on a treadmill because, well, given that you like having that experience and you don't like him having that experience quite so much, yeah, but given that he likes having that experience, he doesn't like you having it quite so much. We're not breaking the symmetry here. You're appealing to the thing that I would like explained.
I'm not sure what to say. I don't know if I think maybe you're looking for an explanation of something that doesn't require explanation. I mean, there is the idea, whether it applies in this case or not. That's another question of explanations have to stop somewhere.
Yeah.
There's not just infinite regress.
Right.
And I think this might be a case where you don't need an explanation as to why you should prefer your own pleasure or satisfaction or happiness rather than someone else's. Maybe it's just immediately obvious. Nothing more needs to be said. But maybe that's wrong, or maybe you think that's wrong. And we could explore whether that's the case, whether it actually is wrong, or is this a case where more actually needs to be said? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, does it seem unsatisfying to just say, like, there is no explanation needed in this case?
A little bit, because there's, I think, one of these ethical lessons you pick up as a kid is, it's learning that you're not special, right? Well, every kid is special, but you know what I mean. Learning that, you're not the center of the universe. That's the admonition you might hear from your parents, right? There are other people here as well, and this seems to be an ethical advance that children make as part of their ethical development. They realize that they're not special, and they should take other people's pains and pleasures into account rather than always attending to their own. So, I guess I'm bringing that intuition into the discussion, and I'm asking, okay, well, in that case, why shouldn't I just count every pain and every pleasure equally, because they are equal, right? Each one is the same. Why should I give special regard to some people's pains over other people's pains? And your answer is, well, because they're yours, or the pains of your immediate loved ones. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I mean, imagine that you had we came across a strange group of beings, right? So Martians, and Martians also privilege a certain group of people's pains, and pleasures. They privilege the pains and pleasures of people born exactly 30 miles away from where they were born, right? Well, it would seem very strange and arbitrary. Why that group? Well, I guess I'm asking you the same question, because they return the question to you. Well, you just privilege the pains and pleasures of people born 0 miles away from you. Why that group?
Short answer, because the people 0 miles away from me are me, and I'm the one who. But let me go back to your point about this idea that you're not the center of the universe. I think you are the center of the universe.
Thank you, Dan.
You're the center of your universe.
Oh, I see.
And I'm the center of my universe.
I thought you were just kissing your advisor's butt.
But I think which connects this connects to an earlier point we're discussing is if you realize, or if you see other people as part of that universe, then growing up ethically doesn't mean no longer seeing yourself as the center of the universe, but rather it consists in seeing how other people contribute to your universe. Mm-hmm. So I actually think it's maybe a tragic mistake for people to give up this idea that you are the center of the universe and you are important. That seems kind of sad to me. I think maybe it's a false alternative to think either you think you're the center of the universe and you don't give a damn about others, or you don't think you're the center of the universe and you subordinate your interest to others. I think those are false alternatives. I think you could continue to see yourself as the center of the universe or your universe, but you could simultaneously, as part of your maturation process, understand how other people can be a great benefit to you, and you can find a way to harmoniously integrate those people into your universe and have a benevolent, lovely, warm, friendly society to live in. So I think maybe this is a way of trying to satisfy this sort of ethical intuition you have about you're not the center of the universe, and kind of rejig that in a way that's compatible with an egoist view. And I guess once you do that, maybe it doesn't sound, or maybe at least sounds different to say, I should prefer my pleasure over this other guy's, because how that looks in practice, when you actually factor in this enlarged, mature view of self-interest, could be very different than you expect. Like, for instance, on a lifeboat, in that case, if the other person is my spouse, what my enlarged, mature sense of self-interest looks like in that case might consist of me actually going down myself and letting her survive. So I don't think we should leap to the conclusion that because you are the center of your universe or the universe, that's obviously going to mean you don't give a damn about that guy's pleasure or other people. It could turn out in surprising ways.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe I'll ask one last question,
okay,
and then we'll wrap this up. So, this idea of grounding ethics in pleasures and pains and sensory experiences, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, doesn't completely ring true to me, because it seems like there are classes of acts that I think of as ethical that are, as it were, they don't harm anybody, but I think of them as unethical. They don't cause any, at least they don't harm anybody in the sense that you're talking about. They don't cause disruption of anybody's conscious state. They don't cause them conscious pains or anything like that. So, like what? Like, for example, well, I can think of several. So, here's number one. Slandering the reputation of a dead person. Now you might be upsetting the family. Yeah, okay, let's assume that they have no family, or maybe they're long dead and they're everybody who ever knew them is dead as well. And yet, it seems unethical to slander a person's memory, even if it's in your own interest to do so. Obviously, it's not going to harm them, or at least it's not going to harm them in the sense that you're talking about. It does harm to their reputation. You might think that's a kind of harm to them, but it's not doing harm to their mental state. It's not causing them pains. Another case is benevolent violations of someone's autonomy. So, suppose I go up to somebody and I cure them of a disease, or I cure them of I say cure. Let's suppose that somebody. I got a good one. I'll just talk about myself. So, I have a learning disability. Suppose that you've been granted some kind of Christ-like power to heal the sick. You say, I know what I'll do. I'll help Bernadette, and you get rid of my learning disability. You did me good, but you might have done something. Or at least maybe you kind of you did me good in a certain sense, right? You got rid of this disability, but you didn't seek my consent first. And I'm sure that I have an instinct that that's immoral. Even if I never find out that you did that to me, I just find that things go differently from then on. Or maybe a slightly different example is, going around, just with a button that gives people feelings of happiness and pleasure, right? And you're just kind of walking around in the park and you just give somebody a kind of rush of pleasure, right? Without their consent. Well, in this kind of basic model of what's good and what's bad, you've done them good. But I don't think it's ethical to do that. I don't think it's ethical to just intrude on somebody's life, even if it's to give them pleasure, without seeking their permission first.
So first of all, I want to say that I don't think it's just the immediate sensory, we might call it physical pleasure sensation, that matters here. Happiness, I think, is also relevant. If that's like eating food might be a good example of just a physical sensory kind of pleasure. Mm-hmm. But then just consider, like, say you work really hard on a project and then you get a reward at work. You're given a raise as a result. That might give you tremendous satisfaction,
right,
but it's of a more psychological kind.
Right.
So I think that needs to be factored in here. And
sure.
So if you just
go
around,
so I've got a machine that goes around and puts people in a good mood for the rest of the day, right? So I just press the button and their mood picks up. But I don't ask them whether they want me to do that to them or not.
Yeah.
I feel there are ethical concerns there. I think overriding somebody's psychological state without their consent, even if you're well-meaning, I sense that there's an ethical problem there.
I think there might be. Yeah, I have.
I think these are intuitions that I think you're going to share because I think you've got strong intuitions about the autonomy of the individual. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I would also try to tie it to self-interest somehow and say that, I'm not sure that you would be doing what's best overall. Well, A, for the person you're giving this jolt of happiness to, and B, for yourself to be acting in this kind of way, going around doing things that are not, that you don't have other people's consent to do, yet that are nevertheless affecting them. I'm not sure.
Well, I might feel great about myself, right? Because, I haven't considered this angle of the fact that I haven't asked for their consent. I've just gone around and, I feel fantastic. I go around and I point my little zapper at people and I put them in a good mood for the rest of the day. And I feel good. I feel like I'm a good person. I spent my day making people feel happy. So I pat myself on the back. So have I done anything unethical in that case? It seems like I have. I mean, I'm not, maybe I'm not the worst person in the world. It's not like I went around putting people in bad moods, but nevertheless, I did something wrong, didn't I? I assumed, I presumed I had the right to just interfere with people's lives and put them in a better mood?
Yeah, I haven't thought this one through much, so I don't know that I have a well worked out answer. So just thinking off the top of my head, I think it might be, even if it is an issue of putting people in bad mood, in good moods without their consent, I think that might be an unethical thing to do. But then I guess, why would that be? Well, one thought I had is that perhaps their bad mood that they were in, assuming they were in a bad mood and not just a neutral kind of, maybe it was because they did something bad, which put them in a bad mood, and it's useful to them to know that, look, if I act in this kind of way, I'm not going to feel good about it, as a means of deterring them from doing that kind of thing in the future. Whereas if you put them in a good mood, I guess they're not going to get that kind of signal, and so that might encourage them to indulge in that behavior more, which had put them in a bad mood.
No, let's change the case and just assume that they're in a bad mood because there's a chemical imbalance. They've got low serotonin, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now they're in a bad mood. I come over, I effectively administer my electromagnetic antidepressant, elevates the levels of serotonin in their brain. They feel better. But I didn't ask them.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's the issue here. It's not that I'm failing to, I'm disrupting the feedback cycle that is telling them that they've done something bad today. No. That's not what's bothering me about this. What's bothering me about this is that I overrode their autonomy as individuals. I inserted myself in this, self-appointed role as their mood savior, and I had no right to do that.
I don't know about this autonomy point, for one thing, like whether, I mean, children come to mind. I mean, they might want to do something, but I think it's appropriate for adults to override their autonomy.
Yeah, I agree. So let's stick to adults.
So if we stick to adults, here's another reason why maybe it wouldn't be good if it's just like a chemical imbalance. Well, side thought, if you do this, I think it would be good to tell them you did it afterwards. I guess that ties into the point I wanted to make anyways, which is, if they know they have this chemical imbalance, and then they just, to their mind, causelessly stop feeling the bad mood, maybe they'll not seek treatment. Whereas if they continued,
then let's make it permanent.
Okay, so you hit the button and then it permanently puts them in a good mood?
It permanently removes the chemical imbalance that was causing them to have bad moods, or worse moods than they otherwise would have had. So they kind of raise their curve so that it's now in sync with what they would have had they not had low serotonin.
Uh-huh. Let's see. I guess if that's the case, is there a reason not to? I don't. My immediate thought is I don't see a reason not to do it in that case. Although I think I
can see good reasons to do it, right? Good, as it were, pro tanto reasons. So I'm not saying that the case is made, but on the one hand, you are making somebody happier. Maybe I can imagine cases where somebody is resisting treatment because their condition is causing them to resist treatment. So we can imagine maybe somebody who's schizophrenic, and we've got a cure for schizophrenia, but they won't allow us to apply it because in their delusional state, they think that we're going to do something horrible to them, that we're some intelligence agency that's looking to put radio transmitters in their brain or something. They've got some complex delusion. They don't want us to give them the treatment. And then in cases like that, you could possibly envisage that there's a justification for overriding their autonomy. But I'm just talking to somebody who's like mildly depressed, has a slight problem with low moods because of a relatively low level of serotonin or some other neurotransmitter in their brain. And you just choose to, without asking them, you just choose to up their serotonin levels permanently. I mean, one of the problems here, I want to be careful here, because one of the problems is they might identify with themselves as somebody who just has a low mood. Right? I'm just a grumpy person, they might say. Right? It's who I am. And so you're changing their personality without their consent. And that seems like a big no-no. But even independently of that, just the very act of, well, let's be honest, performing a medical procedure on somebody, it's not a very invasive or intrusive medical procedure, but it is a medical procedure on someone without their consent. It just seems like a bad thing to do. It seems like unethical, or at least there are big ethical concerns.
This is reminding me of Nozick's experience machine.
Yeah.
So, for the audience, this is an idea where philosopher Robert Nozick had, where you could plug someone into this machine and they could have whatever experiences they desired to have. Would you do it? Would you plug into the machine and have these experiences, like the experience of, I don't know, whatever you want, writing a Beethoven quality symphony or Mozart, and getting all these accolades, or being super wealthy, or whatever. So it would be fake in a sense. You're not really writing this great symphony, but it feels like you did that. In the machine, would you do that? And I guess a lot of people say no to this. That's their intuition, because there's something unsatisfying about it. And it's...
Well, there's a related thought to, I mean, coming back to we're still in the topic of whether or not the good and the bad reduces to the phenomenology of the good and the bad, how it feels to be in pain or to have a pleasure. So yeah, I think there's an interesting case. With Nozick's thought experiment, a lot of people report that they wouldn't go for the phenomenologically happier life, the experientially happier life, if it was inauthentic. But I think I'm pressing a slightly different angle here, because I'm saying also I don't think it's necessarily always good to thrust a phenomenologically good life upon somebody without their consent. It seems like consent seems to be an aspect of ethics that's independent from phenomenology.
Yeah, what I was thinking was that your scenario is like Nozick's, but without consent. Because in Nozick's case, you get to choose to go into this experience. Right. But in yours, it's like you're putting that person into the mix.
Right. So I think mine's objectionable even if it's what they would have chosen. Right? So even if the person, had you asked them, would have said, yes, please, do that. Yeah. I still think you did wrong, because you did it without asking them.
So I was wondering, like, why not either before or after, I guess better would be before, is just ask the person, hey, I've got this device. Yeah. And I can change your mood.
I agree. That's the better thing to do.
Okay, so
now the question is, but how?
And just allow them to make their choice.
Right. So how does this reduce to the phenomenology of? I suppose the first question is, why does that, given a view of ethics that reduces the good to, pains and pleasures and phenomenological feels, how do you account for this, the goodness of asking first? And I guess my second question is, how do you also account for the fact that I think that when you just put somebody in a slightly elevated mood without their consent, you did a bad thing, net. Even though you only created good in terms of phenomenological feels. And I think, by the way, this is independent from your egoism. I think you can be an egoist and think, each person should act according to their own best interests. without also having a view of interests, which reduces them to phenomenal fields. I think those are two separate parts of your view.
Yeah. So one question here is, but by the way, I'm thinking about it. I'm not sure about what I would do in the Nozick case, even though I guess most people say they wouldn't want to go in. I'm not sure how that is whether that can be rationally justified. Like I have this fear that it wouldn't actually turn out the way I think it's going to turn out, and that would be my resistance. But if we can just stipulate that you could go in there and have this amazing experience, like happiness, the greatest. Then I can't think off the top of my head that I have good grounds to choose not to go in there,
right.
Even though it's in some sense fake. So I might be an outlier in this way, in terms of my choice on the experience machine. I just have this fear that I'm going to get stuck.
Well, I think there might be an internal tension here. If you think of everything, all the good and the bad is reduced into phenomenological fields. But if I have an interest in my wife's welfare, right, then your egoism tells me that I should serve that interest. It's ethical to do so. If I'm in the experience machine, the only thing that I'm serving I'm creating impressions that my wife's welfare has been served. I'm not actually serving my wife. I'm not actually serving my interest in my wife's welfare. I'm lying to myself. I'm dreaming. I'm dreaming that things are going well, but I'm not making things go well. I'm dreaming that I'm serving my own interests. I'm not serving my own interests. I think that would be my instinctive line of response for that, to those kinds of experiments. If I were an egoist, but I am concerned that if I were also this phenomenal, if I also bought into your phenomenalism, then I might struggle to make sense of that. I'm not sure.
Oh, so your idea is that the egoist would say he's not actually serving his interests by going into the machine?
So I think an egoist, maybe not you, but an egoist can say, it makes sense to turn down the invitation to step into Nozick's machine, because then you would have a life where you dreamed you were serving your own interests, but you weren't actually serving your own interests. Case in point, you have an interest in the welfare of your children. You're not serving that interest anymore. You're in a machine just dreaming all the time. So you're not serving that interest. It's still your interest, but you're not serving it. You think you are, and you're dreaming that you are, and the machine is telling you that you are, but you're not. You're not actually serving those interests.
Yeah.
That's why it's rational, ethical, not to enter into that machine, to decline the invitation. So an egoist could say that. Could you say it? I'm not sure, because if you reduce, depending on exactly how you tell your story about reducing all goods to fields, phenomenal fields, experiential fields, conscious fields, you might say, all there is to serving your children's interests is creating impressions in your own sphere that your children's interests are served. If you find a way of shortcutting that circuit so you can create those impressions without doing the hard work of actually serving your children's interests, all the better for serving your interests. I would be reluctant to combine that kind of mad dog phenomenalism with your egoism for exactly that reason. I think in cases like that, it's getting strongly counterintuitive results. But
so this is something I've not thought of much, but I guess I don't see a good reason. Maybe I am that outlier egoist who doesn't see a good reason to not go in the machine and just have the illusion that you're taking care of your child's interests and your own interests. But I don't know that that's really a problem for me, since it seems like a very unrealistic kind of situation, given things as they are. But assuming I'm not in this machine, I'm going to be doing, taking care of my child if I had one. So, I mean, I guess you can always, you can stipulate any kind of bizarre case. Like, imagine that by pressing this button, you can feel this awesome experience of happiness, and that pressing that button is also going to kill everybody else on the planet. So you're going to be the last guy left. Yet you're going to have this amazing happiness that you can never experience in any other way. Would you do it? Okay, yeah, I guess I got to say yes. Fine, you got me there, but part of me is like, who cares?
Well, because the case is so contrived and
yes,
weird.
You can paint the egoist into this corner that he's never going to have to.
Well, like I said, I don't think this is painting the egoist into a corner. I think this is
so it's like it's a corner that doesn't matter, or something.
And the phenomenalism, it's the phenomenalism and the egoism together that I think is causing the problem.
So I guess here this is kind of like a way of getting back to
But let me, this response, this is the, this is like Dan Dennett's complaint about certain thought experiments. Somebody comes to you and asks, somebody comes to a biologist and asks, what if a shark gave birth to a cow? Would it be a cow or a shark? Well, the way I said it, it's going to have to be a cow. But if a shark gave birth to something that moves and eats grass, and is it a cow or a shark? And then the answer is, that's a stupid question. It's a thought experiment that it's just simply not going to happen, and we just don't have to make a decision about that. It's contrived just to play havoc with our intuitions. But I don't think the Nozick's experience machine, I think you're being hard on it. So it is a very clean case for philosophers, but there are cases that resemble it in the real world. So cases, for example, of the obvious one, I think, is an opiate addiction. You can get addicted to drugs that can leave you in a state when you're on the drug, you're in a pretty blissful state, and of course all of your actual interests are getting neglected. All your real world interests are getting neglected because you're serving this purely hedonistic interest that you have in being on the drug. And then you have related things with, for example, playing video games all the time, and there's all kinds of partial cases. You go to work, you come home, your kids want to hang out with you, but you don't hang out with your kids. You just go play video games, right? So there are lots of cases. We can think of these as dropout cases. It's cases where you drop out of the grind of pursuing your ordinary interests and ordinary concerns in order to go for some easy, pleasurable option. And I think Nozick's case is just a very pure, highly refined version of this kind of case. So I think you're doing it a disservice by suggesting that it's really weird and out there. It is a little bit out there, but I think it's just a very clean version of some ordinary world choices that we make.
I see Nozick's machine as really out there. It's like it's kind of like a brain in a vat experiment. You could have any possible experience you want just by plugging into this. Imagine the technology it would take to. It's so sci-fi. I don't know that it could ever be done.
But why not just run the same thought experiment with heroin?
But okay, yeah. So let's.
So we've got a refined version of heroin that doesn't cause an adaptation and a tolerance to build up. So you can just keep taking it and having blissful experiences, and just opting out of life.
So we're again. So you're stipulating as part of the case that heroin doesn't have the negative effects it has, withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah, there are people who claim that these problems are partly a function of the fact that heroin is illegal, which means you can't control your dose very carefully. But if you could, then you could have a controlled habit where you don't build up these tolerances. I don't know if that's true or not. I have no expertise in this whatsoever, but I think it's not so outlandish to stipulate that some refinement in the drug's mechanism of action is perhaps discovered, and there is some controllable version of heroin that you can take for years and years, the way people take other drugs for years and years and years without getting a tolerance.
So, yeah, I guess if you could have heroin without the bad side effects, should you do it?
Well, there will be many bad side effects insofar as you're not going to be looking after your real world interests. But it won't have, we can get rid of maybe the cold turkey effects when you come off it. Not that I care about that, I just care about the fact that either you can get rid of the cold turkey or you can just take another shot of heroin, but you can keep this you can stay in this consistent state of bliss for the rest of your life if you choose to do it, if you've got the money, I guess.
And would this state of bliss be better than if the state of bliss you could achieve without the heroin?
Well, normally with the Nozick thought experiment, a lot of the time when this thought experiment is bust open, people ask, oh, which would you choose, right? And so it's a question that's supposed to give you some insight into your preferences. But we're asking it in this context, I think, with respect to whether you'd be serving your interests better by taking the heroin or by continuing to look after what we'd ordinarily say were your interests, the welfare of your family and so on.
Let's flesh the case out a bit more. Maybe then I could give a better answer. So, if by taking this heroin or this special kind of heroin, that means I'm not going to be tending to my children, my family, my friends, and are my relationships with them going to suffer as a result, so that now I don't get any love for my children, my family, my friends? I become a loner because no one wants to be with me.
Well, in reality, they're suffering, but you're in a state of chemically induced bliss where you're absolutely unaware of it. So maybe it doesn't matter to you anymore. All that matters to you is that you're getting and I guess this is what I'm asking about, is this part of your view, that really serving the interests of your loved ones was only a way of getting a dopamine rush anyway. It was only a means to an end. If you got a direct way of getting the dopamine rush, just do that.
I guess. Maybe this is where I'm going to bite a bullet, but then I would argue that because it's an unrealistic bullet, it's not really a big cost to my view, because just like the imaginary button pushing example, where you could feel this amazing happiness that you can only experience by pressing this button, but it's going to kill everyone else in the universe. Okay, fine. I'll push the button. But what significance does that have? What life lessons does that have for me, given the human being I actually am and the way the world actually is? Maybe it highlights the principle that it shows that I really am serious about doing what's best for yourself. But
again, I think we should distinguish between that view, your egoism, doing what's best for yourself, and your egoism plus this additional idea that what's best for yourself must always be cashed out in phenomenal fields. That's the bit that I think is more contentious here. I think there can be goods and bads that don't correspond necessarily to experienced feelings of pleasure and pain, even the refined feelings of happiness and satisfaction.
Well, I mean,
sometimes there can be goods where there's no. My grandfather worked as a miner, and I told you the story before. He worked his whole life. He died at about my age right now of a variant of miner's lung. And I read about this, the conditions in the mines at the time that he was down there, in a book by George Orwell called The Road to Wigan Pier, where he actually went down the mines in my hometown at the time that my granddad was going down the mines, and he describes them in such graphic detail. And what struck me was these were the exact same stories that I'd heard from my grandmother growing up about what it was like for him. And it's just a absolute image of hell. And he worked his whole life and brought money back for his family, and I don't know how often he had feelings of great pleasure, but I think he served his interests, and I think an egoist can say that, and so they can say that it was a life well led, from an ethical standpoint, even if there weren't a lot of times when he was able to sit back and lean back in the hay and enjoy what he created. Nevertheless, it was a life well led. So I think maybe I would want to distinguish, at least as a starting point, to try and kind of make some inroads into this, between whether you're doing something, there may be a way of grounding interests in phenomenal fields that doesn't always require you to have the payday. Right. So we were talking earlier about, you realize that sometimes it's good to do something for your long-term interests, but then you get hit by a bus, so you never reach payday. You never reach the day when you cash all those good actions out in phenomenal currency. But nevertheless, they were good acts, weren't they? You were looking after your own interests, so they were ethically good acts.
So I do remember this conversation about using the example of your grandfather, and I remember one thing I brought up was this idea of what I called metaphysical pleasure. So we might distinguish between like instant gratification kind of pleasure that you get from eating food or having sex, and then this kind of deep mood, which I'm calling metaphysical pleasure, a term I got from objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, which is kind of like it's always there, or at least it's a very long-lasting kind of emotional state you're in, which I think your grandfather might well have had, and it's not like you have to wait for this payday, and you only experience the positively valenced emotion on this one day or discrete time. It's if you think you're living this life well lived, then as you are doing that the whole time, you have this deep, positively valenced mood, which you don't have if you think you're not living a life well lived. I think if you thought you were not living a life well lived, you would be in a bad mood, a malevolent universe is the term Rand uses, versus a benevolent universe. If you're confident you're living a good kind of life, in that moment you feel good about that fact. It might not be like you're smiling all the time or laughing, not in any overt, obvious way, but in a deep kind of way, you feel good about yourself in a way.
Right. But I think maybe this is bringing us back to just an ordinary question
that's a phenomenal experience.
Should be asked of any ethical view, which is, are the goods here going to be cashed down in terms of consequences or something else? And in particular, do things have to go well? So, you would raise this problem for the consequentialist. You'd say, well, what if I acted with good intentions and it didn't work out, right? Bad things happen nevertheless. Well, the consequentialist can go, in two directions here, and you split consequentialists with questions like this. There's some who will say, oh, all that matters is what actually happened. Did you cause good or did you not? And others will say, no, you've got to act in order to intend to cause good. That's what makes it ethical. If you're just unlucky, that doesn't count against it as an ethical act. In the same way, I might ask you, what is acting according to your own best interest? Does it mean acting in such a way that your interests are ultimately served, payday, or acting in such a way that you intend your interests to be served, but it might not work out, but that would still be ethical? Or acting in a way where a reasonable person would predict that your interests would be served, but it might not work out.
So I guess part of me wants to say the intention is what matters, but the reason the intention matters is because having that intention is what's most likely to lead to the best consequences. But then I guess you could say, well, is it then really the consequences?
Yeah, right.
That matter?
So when is my act ethical? When can we call time and say, okay, let's evaluate that act? Do I have to wait until we find out whether or not it all came good, or have I already acted ethically by the time I've served my interests? Whether or not, by the time I've acted in order to serve my interests, whether or not my interests ultimately end up being served by that act. So the case of my grandfather is another good case, right? He did serve his interest in his children growing up healthy and well, but the moment when that happened was after he'd passed, at least for most of his kids. So he never got to see that day, right? But it happened, and it happened largely thanks to his efforts. So he served his interest and putting it in the egoistical language, he served his interest in the welfare of his kids, though he never found out that he served his interest in the welfare of his kids. Right. So this is a slightly different case again, but when does it become an ethical act? Is it enough that you acted in a way that ultimately does that, whether or not you're around to experience it? Or do you have to be around to experience it? Does it have to ultimately succeed? Or does it just have to be that you intend it to succeed and that you acted as rationally as you could to make it succeed? These are questions that you haven't got a position on, but I think they're interesting questions.
Well, I do experience myself at least leaning in certain directions, so maybe I have at least a quasi-position. I think it's in the moments that we can judge. But we have to take the long run into account. But when you say, like, when does an act become ethical? Is it when you're doing it, or is it when you get the payout, like in your grandfather's case? I think it's in the moments, like when he's doing it. So, because that is what's under his control, and on my view, on Rand's view, as I understand it, the moral is the volitional, meaning that the moral is what's up to our choice, our free will, and I don't have control or choice over some outcome that happens after my death. All I have control over, at least direct control over, is what I do now, in the moment. Yeah. So that's, in some sense, that's all I can be judged by, because that's all that's up to me.
Right.
So,
but I can intend the good. I'm just trying to kind of get a feel for the phenomenal aspect of your view, the experiential aspect, where you ground all the goods in experiences. And, I think there are sophisticated ways that you might do that. But I think you really need room to say something like this, that, my mum's happiness after my grandfather's death, right? I'm talking the years and years afterwards. The fact that she grew to an adult, that she had a child of her own, that and so on, all these experiences that she had. were all things that, not specifically, but they were things that my grandfather intended for her. He wanted her to grow up and live a fulfilling life, right? Mm-hmm. He may have been aware, he would have anticipated he wasn't going to be there for all of it. He may have known, given the line of work he was in, he might not be there for very much of it. You know, did he expect to live past 60? You know, not a lot of men in his line of work did. So he knew he was going to miss a big part of her life. But he was trying to set up things to be good for her, you know, long after he had passed. And I think a lot of us have an ethical instinct that we want to make a better tomorrow, knowing we're not going to be in it. We want to leave the world better than we found it. And that strikes me as a very noble and ethical instinct. Now, obviously, he's not serving his self-interest in a very flat-footed phenomenological sense. He's not thinking, there's going to be a day when I get this pleasure as a result of this, right? In fact, much of the reason he's doing it is for my mom's happiness after he has departed. So I think you still might be able to ground ethics in phenomenal feels like happiness, because you could say, what's grounded in my mom's happiness, which is, from a grandpa's point of view, posthumous. But nevertheless, it's grounded in happiness. I think you could do that, but I think there should be enough room in your phenomenal reduction to allow for that, and you're going to have to make sure it's consistent with your egoism.
Yeah. So I would want to ground it in phenomenal happiness, but not his daughter's, his own. Is what I would want to. I would want to argue that.
Yeah, that's what I find.
I would argue that, like, if I put myself in this situation, if I'm the grandfather, mm-hmm. I think in the moments of this hardship, working in the mine, I would feel really good about myself for doing this thing. It makes me happy to set her up for a life of happiness. And so I think there is phenomenal, we keep using this term phenomenal for the audience. It just means like experiential. So if you
should probably put some text much earlier on the screen. I tried to replace it with experiential whenever I thought of doing it. So it's not a familiar term.
I think if you experience, I think if I am the grandfather, I think I would experience what I'm calling this metaphysical pleasure, this deep happiness, knowing that what I'm doing now is most likely going to help my daughter out in the future. So I think there is a way to ground it phenomenologically. You're in his own phenomenology. It's not going to be the kind of positive phenomenology that you get when you're, relaxing at the beach with, sipping a pina colada or whatever, but it's nevertheless, it's a positive phenomenology. And I remember we talked about Jordan Peterson, I think, in connection with this once, and so he has this idea that what matters is not happiness, but meaning.
Yeah.
And I'm not super familiar with Peterson's view, but I think if you do have a meaningful life, which it sounds like your grandfather may well have had, if like he's got this big goal, which is to provide for his children, and that's his goal in life, and everything he does is contributing to that goal, at least a lot of what he does. I think that can provide for a very meaningful life. Right. And having meaning gives you a positive phenomenology.
So your idea of metaphysical, what was it?
Pleasure.
Metaphysical pleasure. This is like this idea of meaning.
Yeah, at least it's in the ballpark. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they're exact.
Meaning as telos, function, purpose. Purpose is a good word.
But you could have a meaning or purpose which is like a negative one. Like if your goal in life is to be like Hitler, there might be some kind of meaning to your life in the sense that you have this unifying thread which is directing all your actions.
Right.
But it would be negatively valenced, I think.
Right. I will say one last comment, I think it's a good thing to end on, is once again, it seems like your egoism is very much wrapped up in, as I said earlier, you're providing an ethics for humans, and it works better when you get to make these appeals to human nature and to human psychology and say, well, humans are not like that, or humans are like that. In this case, you're saying humans aren't the kind of species that don't derive metaphysical pleasure as they go. They do. They not when we make these long-term investments, and we do something for our children, knowing that the happiness that we're thinking of is happiness that's not going to manifest until after we're past. We're the kinds of beings that get some kind of payoff right there and then, and that's essential to defending this as an egoist view. You have to be dealing with a being that's like that.
Yeah, and I think that's. I don't see that as a cost of the view. I mean, I think that's maybe a virtue is that this ethics, egoist ethics, as I understand egoism, is empirical. It's derived from the way things are, from actual human nature, as opposed to an ethics which wishes we were some other kind of being and then hands down a morality for that. We're saying no. Let's given the kinds of beings we are, let's. Rand calls her philosophy a philosophy for living on Earth.
Right.
Which I think is a way of capturing the idea that this is supposed to be a practical ethics, a practical morality, as opposed to as opposed to a supernatural morality, which I think is where a lot of people's ethical thinking comes from.
Or an idealized, an impractical but highly idealized morality, which is how we started the conversation.
Yeah, so there's this kind of dichotomy between what's moral and what's practical in many people's view. But if your goal is to figure out how to live well on this earth, and you see that as the point of morality, then morality has to be practical. The practical is the moral. If you think the goal of the moral is to help you live in this earth, in your life as a human being, then anything that frustrates that is going to be immoral. So it's kind of a harmony between what's moral and what's practical, in her view. Thanks for...
It's a good ending. We ended where we began, so there's a beautiful symmetry to it.
Okay. All right. Great.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks for doing the interview.